So once again, welcome everyone to this presentation, to my senior project presentation that I titled Cultural Crossroads, From Challenges to Impact, Ethnic Churches in the American Mosaic. The project takes a close look at ethnic churches in the United States, examining both their unique challenges and issues, and also examining potential that these churches have. Potential for contextualization, gospel integration, and kingdom impact that these churches can have on the American society. Let me share with you an overview of kind of roadmap where we're going to go with this presentation. First, I'll do a quick intro where I'll introduce my research methods and introduce my thesis statement. In part one, which is called Cultural Exegesis, I will dive deep into this cultural sector of ethnic churches. We'll define what ethnic church is, explore some data, themes, and expressions of identity. In part two, Biblical Integration, we'll explore a gospel theme that is relevant to this cultural sector of ethnic churches. And finally, in part three, Practical Application. I'll present some solutions and strategies and recommendations based on research findings, interviews, and biblical themes that came up during this research. So, introduction. Let me share with you a research method. How did I come up with my data and for this project? For my research, I used a 5-step cultural exegesis framework developed by Dr. Josh Buck. He's one of my professors at Eternity Bible College. And in order to properly and objectively understand this sector of ethnic churches, first step was to learn their story. So it starts with humbly learning the story of this cultural sector. So this was done through academic research, reading a lot of books, a lot of data, a lot of research, but also it was done through qualitative and quantitative research. So interviews, one-on-one interviews, visiting other churches, visiting conferences, and so on. From there, in step 2 and 3, I organized major movements and themes, identifying various expressions in this cultural sector, identity expressions, and also some idols that this cultural sector has. And finally, in step 4 and 5, I identified biblical and practical applications for this group. And so this framework helped me to stay organized and be systematic in my approach to my research. Thesis statement. Let me just read a thesis statement. This will give you a big idea of where we're going and what this whole project is about. Cultural Crossroads examines the unique challenges and opportunities faced by ethnically homogenous churches in the United States. Through an exploration of their present realities, identity struggles, and potential for meaningful integration, this project highlights how these congregations, when guided by biblical principles, can leverage their cultural strengths to enrich American Christianity, foster healthy growth, and fulfill the Great Commission. So, part one, cultural exegesis. And it's appropriate that we begin with asking a question, what is an ethnic church? What do I mean by ethnic church, and how I define what ethnic church is? It's interesting, I think most of us, we can agree on the church part. We know what church is, but what is ethnicity? It's actually somewhat of a debated topic. What is ethnicity? For example, is ethnicity same thing as race? Is ethnicity has to do with the language you speak, or the geographical location of that group? So what is ethnicity? So here's a definition of ethnic church that I came up with, and this is based on insights from anthropologists like Janelle Paris and Brian Howell, and this is the definition that I put forth for ethnic church. So ethnic church is a homogeneous congregation that primarily serves a specific ethnic or cultural group, often composed of first and second generation immigrants. It conducts worship service in the native language of that group and seeks to preserve cultural traditions, customs, and heritage as an integral part of its identity. That is my definition of ethnic church. Now, the key to this definition here is immigrants, and I highlighted that. The process of immigration to another country and integration into that country is one of the biggest factors that shapes this specific cultural sector of ethnic churches. The identity that ethnic churches seek to preserve and reimagine are shaped by the idea of moving into the new country. But ethnic church is not the only one that is shaped by immigration. Because the reality is that it goes both ways. Immigration, the process of immigration shapes the people who move, but also it shapes the country people move into. Dr. Joseph Castleberry, this book was very helpful in my research. He's the president of Northwest University in Seattle area. In his book, The New Pilgrims, explores the idea of how Christian immigrants are renewing America's identity. Fascinating book, and here's what he says. He says, just like American Christians have appropriately see their lives as pilgrimage to heaven, in which they carry out a calling to spread the gospel to everyone as they go, immigrant Christians interpret their journey to the United States as part of that holy pilgrimage, one in which God has shown mighty deliverance and power to save. So the journey of countless refugees and immigrants who come to the United States is not just of economic value or nature, but also there's spiritual aspect to it as well. And just by their presence here, Christian immigrants make a profound impact on the American society. Let me just share with you some quick stats about the impact of Christian immigrants on the United States. In the 1990s, about 90% of Americans identified as Christians. In the 1990s, 90% of Americans identified as Christians. The most recent data from 2024, just half a year ago, states that 62% of Americans identify as Christians. Now, in contrast to that, according to Pew Research, 70% of immigrants identify as Christians. And you see the difference there between those who are in America and immigrants coming in. 70% of them identify as believers. Additionally, Paul Pearson, author of The Dynamics of Christian Mission, he says this: almost every large Western city has over 100 different language ethnic groups. Some of the newer groups have many Christians who immediately start churches. Immigrants are great at coming here and starting their congregations. And he lists Boston and New York as case study for his study, and as an example where traditional American churches are dying, but immigrant churches are booming in those large cities, where there's a lot of influx of new immigrants. And so just like the first pilgrims, many Christian immigrants aspire to renew America's faith and values, envisioning the America, as Pilgrim said, a shining city on a hill. Now, the reality is more complex than it first appears, though. Ethnic churches face significant challenges that could hinder their ability to impact society with the gospel. And that's the reality of many ethnic churches. Many of these challenges arise not just from outside, but from within the ethnic church itself, creating critical gaps that must be bridged for these ethnic churches. The reality on the ground is that for first-generation immigrants, ethnic churches serve as vital cultural centers, offering much more than spiritual nourishment. The reality for any immigrant who comes to a new country is, especially Christian immigrant, is that the church serves not just a worship of God place, but also a place where they can connect with other immigrants, where they can do social networks, and where they can find help to integrate into the society. Gordon Allport, American psychologist, captures this dual role of the church in his book. He shares this. He says, for many ethnic groups, religion usually stands for more than faith. It is the pivot of the cultural tradition of a group. And the clergy, the pastor, may and often do become defenders of culture. This is fascinating. There's certain expectations that are placed on pastors of ethnic churches, not just to be pastors, but to be the bridge, or to, like he said, to defend their ethnicity or to defend their culture. And oftentimes that creates tension within ethnic churches. Alan Anderson and James Fritters, professors of sociology of ethnic studies, offer a cautionary observation regarding this trend, specifically to ethnic churches. Here's what they say. They say, for immigrant church, many of the functions of religion are oriented toward the preservation of ethnic identity. It tends to be a pillar of conservatism, and it often encourages ethnic churches for social isolation from outsiders. And while such isolation can foster a strong sense of community, and we'll talk about that in a minute, there's strong sense of community in ethnic churches, it can also lead to an inward focus that limits meaningful engagement with the host culture, with those outside of the ethnic church. The more inwardly focused, the larger the gap between the ethnic church and the host culture. And over time, this gap hinders ethnic churches' effort to preach the gospel to their local community. Now, this gap exists not only on the outside between the ethnic church and the culture, the host culture, the gap also exists within the ethnic church itself. In the psychology of culture shock, authors studied this and very topic, and they conclude with this. They say, adolescents are quicker to absorb the values of the new culture than are their parents. And their differential rate of acculturation has been cited as a significant source of conflict in immigrant families. So immigrant family moves, they join an immigrant church, and then younger generation tends to integrate faster, and that creates a gap within the ethnic church, between the generational gap as one of the examples. And so these conflicts are not just in families, as mentioned here, but also in church families, where younger members often feel caught or stuck between the two worlds, striving to honor their heritage while navigating the new realities in schools and colleges and just in the new country. One example of this internal gap in ethnic churches is there's many examples, but one example is the linguistic gap that happens between the generations. While many younger members grow up speaking their native language, oftentimes they lack fluency in specialized settings like the church. One of the interviews I did was with a local pastor of a Hispanic church. And this pastor noticed that it's a Spanish-speaking church, and he noticed that younger people in his church, there's a gap, there's a disconnect. And he did a survey of his church, and he said that he was shocked after his survey. It's a Spanish-speaking church. He said that he found that most young people reported understanding only about, and I quote, 20% in Spanish at church, despite speaking it fluently at home. Specialized setting like the church. And so these are just some examples of the gaps that ethnic churches experience externally and internally. And so faced with these tensions, ethnic churches often find themselves at crossroads. Do we change? Do we adapt? Do we hold tight to the familiar? Or, most often than not, this tension leads to a natural and complex response that I called the resistance. The resistance. Let's do a little Bible study here. Remember the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, records a story of Jesus preaching his very first recorded sermon. Jesus comes to his hometown, and he preaches a sermon to a synagogue where he grew up. He preaches a sermon, and he opens up the scroll of Isaiah, what we call Isaiah 61, and he reads about the anointed one who is to come. Who will come, and the anointed one will heal, will give sight to the blind, and he gives the list. And then at the end of his speech, he makes a shocking claim. He says, I am the anointed one. I am the Messiah, who it was prophesied about. Now, do you remember the reaction of his congregation? They got angry and they drove him out of town and tried to kill him. What's fascinating about that story is that the reason they drove him out of town and tried to kill him, not because of his claim that he was the Messiah. It was because in his sermon, he expanded the grace and salvation of God to those who are outside of nation of Israel. Not because he claimed to be the Messiah, but because he expanded the grace of God, the salvation of God, to the Gentiles. They resisted the message of the expansion of the gospel. And this resistance to inclusivity of all nations is not just an ancient problem, it remains a challenge with churches today, many churches, including ethnic churches. Because immigrant churches are homogenous and monocultural, there is a common tendency to resist engagement with those beyond their cultural boundaries. And this resistance is often a protective mechanism against the challenges of integrating into a new society, which leads to a huge problem called ethnocentrism. In basic terms, ethnocentrism is belief that your culture is superior to other culture. That's what ethnocentrism means. My culture is better than that culture. It's when we view our culture, our traditions, our customs as good, and other cultures as backwards, primitive, or just off. They're wrong. We're right, they're wrong. That's ethnocentrism. Back to the book Cultural Shock, the author says this: immigrants can respond to second culture influences by remaining staunchly monocultural in their traditions of origin, and, if anything, becoming more ethnocentric in the process. So this has been very well documented that that's the tendency of many ethnic churches to, as a response to new culture, to cultural shock, to this integration into new society or lack of it, there's a tendency for ethnocentrism. Let's close our doors, let's close in, and let's resist the host culture. And so as a result, many ethnic churches retreat into cultural enclaves, where ethnocentrism reinforces a sense of security that helps preserve identity and a feeling of belonging. Every person wants to belong. And so ethnocentrism often leads to dangerous tendencies that ethnic churches experience. And so let me list just a few of these points of resistance that many ethnic churches experience as a result of ethnocentrism. The first one I want to mention is isolationism and separatism as one of the results of this resistance or ethnocentrism. I briefly mentioned this as one of the external gaps that occur when cultural preservation becomes a priority for a church. It's let's isolate, let's separate. A name you might be familiar with, Vyacheslav Tsvedenko, provides a case study example of how this dynamic manifests specifically in Slavic churches in the United States. He did a huge study that was part of his doctoral dissertation and his book eventually. He did a huge survey of Pacific Coast Slavic Baptist Association churches, and here are one of his conclusions. He said, an isolationist attitude towards American society in general and the Christian community in particular keeps church members at a distance from the real Americans. This slows down the process of acculturation in an adaptation to the new country. He continues to argue, and his argument is that this isolation hinders not only smooth adaptation to new society, but most importantly, it hinders ethnic churches' opportunity to preach the gospel with the local community. Second point of tension as a result of resistance and ethnocentrism is when ethnicity becomes an idol for ethnic churches. This happens when retaining ethnic identity becomes highest priority for a church. The result is that church becomes a cultural, social gathering rather than a Christ-centered community. There's a fascinating book written by Prema Kurian. She did a study of ethnic Indian churches in the United States. And they are part of denomination or church called Mar Thoma Church. They have, it's a big denomination. Here are her conclusions studying Indian ethnic churches. She says, the community-oriented nature of the Mar Thoma Church was seen as diluting its spiritual goal. Many of the youth seem to feel that the Mar Thoma Church was, and she quotes one of the interviewees, she says, just a social gathering, not a faith community united in worship. Point here is that when focus shifts from worshiping God to preserving cultural traditions and identity, the church is in trouble. No matter what ethnicity, no matter what color, that's a global problem for churches, and here specifically for ethnic churches. My research revealed other dangers of ethnocentric tendencies like idolatry of comfort, racism and prejudice in some cases, closed-door policy or mentality. But one of the major points that I wanted to end with in this section is a lack of local missional engagement. One of the strengths that ethnic churches have is emphasis on international missions. Ethnic churches are really good about international missions, sending pastors, planting churches, financing projects. They're great. Unfortunately, this hyper-focus on foreign missions can undermine efforts here locally. And so oftentimes people are trained to be missional abroad, but not missional locally. Mark Demas, in his amazing book, speaking of this issue, he said this: there is a willingness in ethnic churches to cross the ocean, but not to cross the street. So all these tensions, gaps, and resistance reveal challenges ethnic churches must overcome to fulfill their God-given mission to preach the gospel where God planted them locally. Question is, how do they do it? How do they overcome, or how do they bridge these gaps? Where to even begin? And this leads me to the second part of my presentation of this project. It's biblical integration. The solution is always in the Bible. The antidote to ethnocentric resistance is a theologically and biblically grounded understanding of doctrine of Missio Dei. Embracing Missio Dei not only aligns ethnic churches with God's purpose, but also it empowers them to see themselves as part of a bigger plan for humanity. What is Missio Dei? What do I mean by doctrine of Missio Dei? Missio Dei is a Latin term that simply means mission of God, or it literally means sending of God. And the idea is simple, that it's simple and yet it's not. That God is a sending God who is on a mission. God is on a mission, and church has an opportunity to be part of this mission. This is a fairly recent doctrine. It was developed in the 20th century, and two people who really pushed this doctrine is David Bach and Jürgen Moltmann. I just want to read their quotes that expand on what Missio Dei is. Mission is not primarily an activity of the church, but an attribute of God. God is a missionary God, says David Bosch. Similarly, Jürgen Moltmann says, it is not the church that has a mission of salvation to fulfill in the world. It is the mission of the Son and the Spirit through the Father that includes the church. Missio Dei is significant doctrine for ethnic churches to understand because it shifts their focus. It shifts their focus from us-centered to God-centered. It's not anymore about our culture, our tradition, and trying to retain them. It's about where does God see us in the culture that He placed us in, and how can we be part of Missio Dei, of part of His mission. Now, it becomes very clear just how critical Missio Dei is for the church when we begin to trace it through the arc of biblical story. Of course, beginning in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, fall happens and God makes a promise that He's going to send an offspring. He's going to send an offspring who will crush the head of the serpent. And here already we see the trajectory of Missio Dei, beginning from the very first pages of the Bible to there's a problem of sin, and God the Father, who is a sending God, He's going to send a promised offspring to resolve that issue. In Genesis 12:3, God makes a covenant with Abraham. And in that covenant, God gives Abraham a few promises of blessings. And one of the central promises there is that through Abraham, all nations of the earth, or all families of the earth, will be blessed. And in that covenant, we see a global aspect to Missio Dei. Missio Dei, mission of God, God is not just for one nation. He is for up to saving the whole world. He is after the whole entire world, all humanity. One example of that is Jonah chapter 4, verse 11, to where God sends this God sends this hesitant prophet who resists God's mission. Because why? Because God has a plan for someone outside of his nation. And then he ends and he said, should I not pity Nineveh, God says? And he is for all nations. Now, interestingly, in this biblical arc of Missio Dei, there's place for immigrants and migration. Migration plays a critical role in the unfolding of God's mission. Once again, Vyacheslav Tsirenko says this in his book. He says, migration is a part of the history of the people of God. Migration was a part of life of Jews in the Old Testament times. It also has been a part of life of Christianity since its beginning. There is a link between the mission of God, Missio Dei, and migrant movements. We see this play out from patriarchs like Abraham and Joseph to Babylon exile. God uses movement of his people for the sake of his mission. One such example, of course, is Jeremiah 29:7, where God's people are in exile in Babylon, and God tells them, in exile, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Earlier in the chapter, God encourages the exiles to integrate into this new country, into this new society. Build homes, he says, plant gardens, marry, and be that shining city on a hill. Now, the trajectory of Missio Dei, of course, crescendos in the New Testament with the coming of Jesus, the Messiah. Life and ministry of Jesus embody the ultimate act of God's mission. And Jesus begins his ministry with a mission statement or proclamation in Mark chapter 1, verse 15, where he says, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. And so through Jesus, the long-promised blessing of all nations takes on flesh and blood. Now it's not an abstract promise to Abraham. Now it's a real person, Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah who's walking on this earth. And so Missio Dei reaches its pivotal moment in Jesus' death and resurrection, of course, fulfilling ancient promise of Genesis 3:15, where the head of the serpent is crushed, sin is defeated, death is defeated. Speaking to his disciples on the road to Emmaus, after his resurrection, Jesus says these words. He says, thus it is written, that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead, and the repentance for the forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. And of course, the mission of God did not stop with this proclamation. In Matthew 28:18, Jesus gives the Great Commission, and he commissions his disciples and the church, us, to go there, therefore go and preach the gospel to, again, all nations. In Acts chapter 2, 50 days after Jesus' resurrection, on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit enables the disciples to speak in various languages, reaching many ethnicities, many nationalities. The confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel is symbolically reversed, and the multicultural church is born at the day of Pentecost. Looking ahead, of course, in Revelation 7:9, we see the fulfillment, the future fulfillment of Missio Dei, where John sees a vision and it says, after this I looked and behold a great multitude that no one could number from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they're worshiping. all nations, all languages, worshiping Jesus. And so biblical arc of Missio Dei highlights the heart of God for the world. And when ethnic churches understand and embrace Missio Dei, they can move beyond the resistance, they can bridge the gaps and ethnocentrism, and they can participate in God's mission. And embracing Missio Dei not only aligns church with God's vision, but empowers them to navigate the cultural crossroads they find themselves on, realizing that they are strategically positioned as bridges between cultures in the United States. They're strategically positioned with unique abilities, with unique traits to transform the society that they find themselves in. And that leads me to the third and final part of cultural crossroads and its practical application. Now let me start with this example, power of leverage. Power of leverage. Throughout history, people have always used the power of leverage to build, to move, and to innovate. Egyptians used it to build the pyramids. Armies use it to build war machines. Children use it on the playground. And the concept is simple of leverage. The right application of force, strategically positioned, can achieve result far beyond what seems possible. That is the power of leverage. The right application of force, strategically positioned, can achieve the result far beyond what seems possible. And where I'm going with this is that in the same way ethnic churches possess unique abilities, unique traits, unique identities, and if leveraged correctly, can produce transformative result in the society. Jehu Hensels, he's a missiologist. He argues exactly this regarding immigrant churches. He says this: modern migration movement is also a missionary movement based on the fundamental premise that every Christian migrant is a potential missionary. The new Christian migrants and their descendants will clearly have, and he's making a prediction here. It's a bold prediction. He says that new Christian immigrants and their descendants will clearly have a lasting impact on the American religious landscape. The new immigrant congregations are performing a vital missionary function by their very presence in the United States. And so let me list just a few strengths of ethnic churches, of ethnic communities, these leverage points that ethnic churches possess, based on my research and observations, both from literature and my interviews, that I believe ethnic churches can use to leverage for the benefit of the kingdom of God. One of the first and obvious ones is strong family values. Strong family values. You know, as family values in the United States continue to degrade, ethnic churches often stand out as a compelling example of strong family units. What it means to stay together. I don't have time to go into all the statistics, but these are stats from the most recent Pew research. But data consistently shows that immigrants place greater emphasis on marriage, childbearing, and importance of two-parent households. It's beyond of what it is in the broad American society. Immigrants place huge emphasis on families. And so the strength goes beyond these stats. The strength of family values goes beyond just numbers. These family values are woven into the fabric of immigrant communities. In one of my interviews with Edward Kislyanka, he's the lead pastor of House of Bread Church in Sacramento, he was talking about this a lot in their experience as they're moving into multicultural model for their church. He said that there is a hunger in our culture for family and traditional values. He said that at times when many American families are fractured and broken, ethnic churches serve as a place of stability and belonging. So when people observe an ethnic church, they come in and they see families sitting together, they see children that's something that maybe they're missing from their home, they're missing from their lives. And so that's a huge leverage point that ethnic churches can leverage. Second point of strength is communal mindset. In an era when many churches struggle with disengaged members, ethnic churches offer a compelling vision for biblical community. Ethnic churches are very strong when it comes to communal mindset. Oftentimes their community, it nurtures belonging, family-style belonging, accountability. They're big on accountability and spiritual growth. Dr. Castleberry, he notes that in his book, and he says this: readers familiar with America's churches in the past will recognize and perhaps pine for what we have lost through stagnant church isolation and mega-church anonymity. Immigrants and their churches offer a living memory of America's past values. As immigrants and their adult children and grandchildren make up an increasing percentage of the American population, their family and ecclesial collectivism will take America back to the future. Another prediction, another positive prediction and hope for impact that ethnic churches can make. Third point of leverage is rich cultural heritage and identity. Jehu Hensel, once again, he says, the new immigrants also bring with them new devotional expressions and spirituality. Now, this point is sometimes or oftentimes overlooked or even avoided by kids of immigrants or second-generation immigrants. Cultural heritage and identity, but in reality is that cultural heritage and this unique identity can actually help and be leveraged to make ethnic churches unique in preaching the gospel. Rather than blending into mainstream American culture, ethnic churches provide a fresh avenue for gospel message. Things like unique worship expressions, unique music styles, unique approaches to liturgy, how we do Sunday services, and communal traditions can be leveraged to preach the gospel. Now, the list can go on and go on with different traits. In addition to strong family values, communal mindset, rich cultural heritage and identity, few quick other things that came through my research. Resilience and innovation. To immigrate to another country, it takes guts and it takes resilience and to be innovative. And oftentimes, that reflects in how ministry is done, how churches innovate, and that can be a leverage point as well. In that point, there's amazing stats about immigrants and business owners. Immigrants are on the rise and making money. They know how to make money, and oftentimes that innovation translates into how church is done, being innovative in preaching the gospel. Another one is conservative and traditional values, hospitality and generosity, and global perspective or global worldview. All of these can be leveraged by ethnic churches for the God's kingdom. And that's the point. If positioned strategically and with the power of the Holy Spirit, these things can be leveraged for kingdom impact. One last thing, let me share a few models of integration. These are practical models of integration that many ethnic churches have implemented and to reach their communities with the gospel. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. However, these models represent the most common approaches that many ethnic churches took to fulfill Missio Dei, fulfill their purpose, leverage their abilities, and preach the gospel locally. 4 models that I wanted to highlight. Number 1 is English service model. In this model, an originally homogenous ethnic church that is monocultural and homogenous introduces an additional service conducted in English. This service is culturally contextualized to reach the local community. Model number 2, I wish I would have time to go in depth, and maybe someday I will into each of these models. Model number 2 is bilingual service model. This is when ethnic church conducts its service in both languages within the single service, alternating in language during worship programs and sermons. Back and forth can happen via the headphones or live on stage during the service. Model number 3 is integrated church. Integrated church. This is when a homogenous ethnic church joins with a mainstream American church. Ethnic congregation holds a separate service on Sundays, but becomes part of the host church's structure, its leadership, budget, bylaws, and everything else. So this is not an ethnic church starting an English service. This is an ethnic church or a group of ethnic community joining an existing American mainstream church. One great example of this, and I have the examples on the right, just some examples from my research. Butler Community Church here in town, they're doing an amazing job. This was an originally homogenous white church, and over the past 30 years, 2 ethnic congregations joined them. So now every Sunday they have 4 services. They have 2 services in English, they have a Spanish-speaking service, and they have a Lao, East Asian community that join in them as well. From each of these services, pastors are part of the elder board, and that's how that church functions, and they're doing awesome. And finally, model number 4, ascending church model. In this model, ethnic church may choose to remain homogenous for a season, for whatever reason. However, its mission, the mission of this ethnic homogenous church, is to grow, train, and send pastors to plant multi-ethnic churches. Just a great example of this is Living Stream Church in Jacksonville, Florida. I interviewed Bogdan Bondarenko, he's the lead pastor there, and that's what they did. In addition to starting an English service, what they also did is they are the sending church. They planted, a couple of years ago, they planted a church called Vision Church, and now that church is in the same city. That church is now like over 500 members, and the original church did not lose any members at all. And so that's an interesting model as well. And so this is not an exhaustive list. However, these models represent the most common approaches observed. And what I wanted to say is that behind each one of these models, talking to these pastors, doing this research, there's months and years of prayer, fasting, planning, strategizing, debating. Behind each of these models, there's a church life that happens, a community that is growing. So let me conclude with this. Ethnic churches stand at a pivotal cultural crossroads. While cultural, linguistic, and generational divides have created some gaps and require bridging, these very challenges also hold transformative potential for ethnic churches. The framework of Missio Dei, the doctrine of Missio Dei, invites ethnic churches to transcend cultural barriers and leverage their unique strengths in fulfilling the Great Commission and ultimately the vision of a diverse and yet unified church as described in Revelation 7:9, where all nationalities, all languages, all traditions are standing before the throne of Jesus Christ and are worshiping together. And by God's grace, ethnic churches have the potential to transform cultural crossroads into missional outposts, where faith and culture converge to enrich the American mosaic with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thank you guys for your attention. Now I'll open up for some questions. We have about 10 minutes. If you guys have some questions, you can ask. I'll retell the question into the mic, and I'll try to answer. I'll try to respond. It's Q&R. Yes?
In your research, did you find if there was any research that looked at how the host country's attitude towards immigrants impacted immigrants' ability to integrate, Christian immigrants' ability to integrate versus isolation? So did host country's attitude impact integration versus isolation?
The question is, what impact has the host country on ethnic churches and their ability to integrate? Interesting. It briefly appeared in my research. Again, my focus was on ethnic churches, but I think it's part of that external gap. And Cvirinko, in his book, he mentions, and even in that quote, he mentions that gap of between not just ethnic churches and culture in general, but also between other Christians. And I think ethnic churches, from what I've observed, do there is this gap between mainstream Christianity and ethnic churches. And again, it's partially due to ethnocentrism and the integration and all these struggles. But it just, I think, oftentimes it's just for mainstream churches, they overlook the reality of ethnic church, because ethnic churches tend to be on a quieter side. They live in their own bubbles, and I think there's just a big disconnect. But even in our city, I've seen good examples, even through our cluster that we have in Southeast Fresno. We have a good amount of ethnic churches that are part of that cluster, and even recently there was a prayer, National Day of Prayer, and they were praying over the mayor, and that was great to see. So I think it's getting bridged, but yeah, that's.
Have you again, in your research, seen any examples of effective ethnic church fulfilling the mission towards ethnic people of that same ethnicity? Ethnic to ethnic.
Yeah. Locally, you mean?
Yeah.
Because again, the question is, in the research, did I see ethnic churches reaching their ethnicity locally? I did not go too deep into that. I think it comes naturally for a lot of these ethnic churches. And again, ethnic churches are, like I mentioned, are great about global missions. For a long time, they've been great about it, but they miss the local part. I think from what I've observed, it depends on the population of that ethnicity in that city. So for Hispanic churches, obviously, they're doing great. I mean, even locally, we have a Catholic church that reaches Catholics. I mean, they're like close to 1,000 members, I believe. So yeah, I think that comes naturally for churches. Again, it's part of that immigrants find immigrants easily from the same ethnicity. Slavic.
One question, not for record. Why you didn't
Before not for record, let's do one more for record,
Okay.
and then we'll do not for record.
Why you didn't do it 30 years ago in our church?
Question is why I didn't do this research 30 years ago. For the record, 30 years ago, I was, how old? I was 9 years old, so
Okay.
a little too young.
But even Zirinko, thank you for mentioning him a few times. He did long time ago, but see how many years wasted. So maybe I missed. Do you have in your research how to avoid wasted time? See you talking about debates, a lot of prayers, and but so many years wasted. That's I think
Yeah.
the guilt part of any church.
The question is, how can ethnic churches, not waste time and implement this? And the experience from the audience member was that this should have been done in ethnic churches a long time ago, and it feels like 30 years has been wasted. I think, from my perspective, it's that part two, the biblical integration. I think, sadly, many ethnic churches, they've been focused on themselves. And there's reasons for that, and there's all excuses for that, but focus needs to be on the mission of God, gospel. And when we're rooted in the gospel, that helps us to propel ethnic churches for outreach. So I think it's biblical integration. Bible needs to be preached and taught to people in the church. Let's do one more question.
That kind of goes with that question, or your answer might be where you answered it, is the idea like, so on those churches you met with, the different models, what shifted in their mindset to go from an ethnic church to be like, let's do English, let's do multicultural, like what was it that clicked?
So the question is, what was the shift in some of those examples that I researched in those ethnic churches, why they went for integration? I think a couple factors. I think one of the biggest factor, and maybe it's a selfish factor, it's seeing their kids leave. It's that gap, the internal gap between generations. And once that starts happening, people, like I want my kids to be, I want my kids to worship with me. I think that's one of the reasons. And again, I think God works through that. People wake up to the reality. And I think also the younger generation gets more educated, more biblically educated, and they see that something is off. We need to be missional. I think I would mention those two factors. Let's do one more question. I see a hand.
Of course, in your research, was there any positive cases for ethnic churches, people who moved here, being successful without integrating with the local community, without integrating with the culture, and long term?
Not doing. Yeah. So the question is, in my research, did I find any ethnic churches who did not integrate and they were still successful? Yes. I can mention, I don't want to mention names, but I can mention churches in Sacramento where there's a big Slavic population, and these churches are very successful with ethnic churches. I can mention, again, Hispanic churches here locally. But that depends on influx of immigrants coming in. The minute the immigration stops, these churches start questioning things, and obviously it goes down. So it works until immigration stops. And again, none of this research, from my research, I wouldn't say that ethnic churches should stop evangelizing to their own ethnicity. They should continue, but there has to be a long-term vision that integrates Missio Dei. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. God bless.